In courtroom 4C of the Mecklenburg County Courthouse, on the second Tuesday of October, a single sheet of cream-colored stationery was about to end a 14-year marriage, and it wasn't the sheet either attorney had prepared for. Outside, the leaves along East Trade Street had just started turning, and the morning traffic into Uptown was its usual slow crawl of commuters and delivery trucks, entirely indifferent to the fact that inside one particular courtroom on the fourth floor, a marriage that had looked, for over a decade, like a genuine success story, was about to be revealed as something else entirely. Derek Marsh sat at the respondent's table in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's mortgage payments, his knee bouncing beneath the table in the one tell his wife of 14 years had learned to read better than his own mother could. Beside him, his attorney, Grant Whitfield, was mid-sentence, walking the court through a narrative he'd rehearsed for weeks, that Elena Marsh, 38 years old, mother of two, had contributed minimally to the marital estate, that she had a documented history of postpartum depression she'd never fully disclosed, that she was, in Whitfield's words, a woman who chose comfort over ambition and now wants to be compensated for a career she never built. Elena sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, and if anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed that her thumb was resting, very lightly, on the corner of a plain manila folder that her attorney, Danielle Reyes, had not yet opened. Derek smiled. It was small, and it was meant only for her, a private little curl at the edge of his mouth that said, without a single word, "You brought a folder, and I brought a law firm." He had no idea what was inside it. Judge Miriam Castellano, 61 years old, 22 years on the family court bench, glanced at the clock, then back at Whitfield, and said, "Counsel, I'd like to move to equitable distribution. Miss Reyes, I understand you have documentation to enter into the record." Danielle Reyes stood, buttoned her blazer, and said, "Yes, Your Honor. The petitioner would like to enter Exhibit 14, a handwritten letter dated February 3rd of last year, authored by the respondent, Derek Marsh, and addressed to Ms. Bianca Cole." The bounce in Derek's knee stopped. Whitfield's pen, mid-note, stopped moving too, and somewhere behind the respondent's table, in the second row of the gallery, Bianca Cole, who had been subpoenaed as a witness for an entirely different reason and did not yet know what was coming, sat up a little straighter, because she recognized that letter. She had read it more than once. She had, in fact, kept it in a drawer in her apartment on Selwyn Avenue for 8 months before Derek asked her, very casually, over dinner, whether she still had it. She had lied and told him she'd thrown it away. Judge Castellano took the folder from the bailiff, opened it, and began to read. The courtroom went silent in the particular way that only happens when everyone in the room senses, all at once, that something has shifted. Derek Marsh, real estate developer, self-made man, a person who had spent 14 years believing he was the smartest one in every room he ever walked into, was about to learn that his wife had spent the last 11 months building a case so precise, so patient, and so devastating that by the end of the afternoon, the story people would tell about this divorce would have nothing to do with Elena's postpartum depression at all. It would be about the letter. But to understand how a single piece of paper ended up in that folder, and how a woman everyone in Derek's circle had quietly written off as just Elena, outplanned a man with 3 attorneys on retainer, you have to go back. Not to the affair, not even to the money. You have to go back to the beginning, before any of it, to a much smaller, much quieter version of this story, the one where nobody suspected a thing. Before we get into how this ends, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city in the comments. And I want to know something else. Have you ever had to fight to get even with someone who thought you'd never figure it out? Tell me, I want to hear it. Elena Voss grew up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the middle daughter of a high school biology teacher and a nurse, in a house where nobody raised their voice and nobody left dishes in the sink overnight. She studied interior architecture at NC State, graduated in 2009 with a portfolio full of restrained, elegant residential work, and took her first job at a firm in Raleigh doing space planning for boutique hotels. She was good at it, quietly, methodically good, the kind of good that shows up in client retention numbers rather than headlines. She met Derek Marsh in the spring of 2010 at a mutual friend's engagement party in Cary. He was 26, working construction management for a mid-sized builder, talking with the kind of confidence that made people lean in, telling anyone who'd listen that he was going to build his own company by 30. Elena, 24 at the time, found him charming in the specific way that ambitious men can be charming to people who've never had anyone push that hard for anything. They married in October 2011, in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Asheville. 60 guests, a string quartet, Elena's father giving a toast about how proud he was that his daughter had found someone who matched her drive. For the first 3 years, it looked, from the outside, like exactly that kind of marriage. They rented a small 2-bedroom apartment off South Boulevard, and on weekends, Derek would drive them out to look at land parcels he couldn't yet afford, narrating what he'd build there someday, with the kind of specific, detailed confidence that made Elena believe every word of it. She sketched floor plans for him on napkins at diner booths, for fun, never expecting any of it to become real. An open-concept kitchen here, a mudroom off the garage there, and Derek kept every single one of those napkins in a shoebox in their closet for the first 2 years of their marriage, a fact Elena would only remember, with a strange ache, over a decade later, long after the shoebox itself had disappeared somewhere in one of their moves. Whatever else Derek Marsh became, in those early years he was, by every account including Elena's own, genuinely present. Cooking dinner some nights when she worked late, driving 40 minutes each way to help her parents move a couch, showing up, without being asked, to a stressful client walkthrough just to stand quietly in the back of the room because she'd mentioned she was nervous about it. It was this version of Derek, the early one, that made everything that came later so much harder to reconcile. Not because Elena couldn't believe people changed, but because some part of her kept looking for that man, in the one who eventually stopped coming home. Derek founded Marsh Premier Developments in 2013 with a $40,000 loan from his father-in-law and a single spec house in a growing subdivision outside Huntersville. Elena, still working at the design firm, helped him stage that first house herself, chose the paint colors, sourced the light fixtures, arranged the furniture for the open house, and it sold in 11 days, $22,000 over asking. Derek liked to tell that story at dinner parties for years afterward, though as time went on, the version he told left Elena's name out of it more and more. Their daughter Sophie was born in June 2014. Their son Mason followed in March 2017. Somewhere in between the two pregnancies, Elena quietly stepped back from full-time design work, not because Derek asked her to, not in so many words, but because Marsh Premier Developments was growing fast, closing on 4, then 7, then 11 properties a year, and someone needed to manage the household, the school pickups, the pediatrician appointments, the in-laws, the endless logistics of a family whose primary breadwinner was rarely home before 8. She didn't stop working entirely. By 2018, she'd built a modest but steady interior design consulting practice under her own name, Elena Voss Interiors, doing staging and design consultations for 6 to 9 clients a year, bringing in around $34,000 to $41,000 annually, depending on the season. Money she mostly funneled straight back into the kids' activities, the family's second car, small things Derek never seemed to notice or ask about. Because by then, Marsh Premier Developments was doing 7 figures a year in revenue, and $38,000 looked, to him, like pocket change. The practice was small, but it was hers in a way nothing else in her life quite was. She built it entirely through word of mouth. A staged listing in Myers Park that sold in 6 days led to a referral for a full guest house renovation in Dilworth, which led to a consultation for a young couple in Elizabeth, who then referred her to 2 more couples the following year. By 2022, she had a modest waitlist, something she never mentioned to Derek because on the one occasion she had, early in the marriage, excited about landing her first 5-figure renovation contract, he'd responded by asking whether that meant she'd have less time to handle things at home, a question that landed like a small, deliberate closing of a door, and one she never gave him the chance to close again. After that, she simply stopped bringing her work to the dinner table. It became a part of her life Derek knew about, only in the vaguest outline. A hobby that happened to pay for itself, as far as he was concerned, rather than the quiet foundation of competence and independence it actually was. That was the first quiet cruelty, long before any of the ones that came later. The way he began, gradually, without ever saying it out loud, to treat her contributions as decorative, cute, not real work. Something she did to keep busy. It showed up in small ways first. At a dinner party in the fall of 2019, hosted by one of Derek's newer investor contacts, a man asked Elena what she did, and before she could finish answering, "I run a small design consulting practice, mostly residential staging," Derek cut in, laughing, and said, "She keeps the home front running so I can build the empire." A line that got a warm chuckle from the table and made Elena's stomach tighten in a way she couldn't fully explain to herself that night, lying in bed, replaying it. It happened again at his 40th birthday dinner in 2021, when his business partner at the time, a man named Phil Aldrich, raised a toast to "the guy who built all this from nothing," and Derek, 3 drinks in, nodded along without once mentioning that the $40,000 seed loan for Marsh Premier's very first house had come from Elena's father, or that Elena had staged that house herself, on her own time, 3 weeks postpartum with Sophie strapped to her chest in a carrier. Their 5th anniversary, in October 2016, Derek forgot entirely. Not a small oversight, but a full day, no card, no acknowledgement, until Elena mentioned it quietly over dinner, and he said, genuinely surprised, "Wait, that was today?" Before promising to make it up to her the following weekend, a promise he kept by taking her to a steakhouse and spending most of the meal on a phone call about a permitting delay in Matthews. Their 10th anniversary, in 2021, he did remember, and took her to Asheville for a weekend at the same vineyard where they'd married. A gesture that touched her, until she realized, months later, going through a credit card statement for an unrelated reason, that the trip had been booked and paid for by Bianca's predecessor, Kayla, as part of Kayla's assistant duties, meaning Derek hadn't so much as picked the restaurant. He missed Sophie's kindergarten dance recital in May 2019 for a closing on the Noda property, and missed her 4th grade science fair in 2023 for what he described as an investor call that genuinely could not move, though Elena would later learn, during discovery, that no such call existed on his calendar for that date at all. Mason's Little League games twice a week every spring from 2018 onward were attended by Elena alone in probably 4 seasons out of 6, Derek showing up occasionally for the final game of a tournament, arriving in the 4th inning, standing at the fence in his work clothes, taking photos he'd post that same night with captions like "Proud Dad" that collected 40, 50, sometimes over 100 likes from people who had no idea how rarely he'd actually been there for the other 31 games that season. None of it, on its own, was the kind of thing you could point to and say, "This is when the marriage broke." That was the particular difficulty of it, the thing Elena would later try, unsuccessfully, to explain to her sister. It wasn't one wound, it was 1,000 small ones, each easy to explain away in isolation, each one, individually, forgivable. Derek was building something real. Derek was tired. Derek didn't mean it that way. She told herself some version of that sentence for the better part of a decade, and by the time she stopped telling herself that sentence, she barely remembered what it had felt like to believe it. In 2015, after Sophie's birth, in the fall of 2014, Elena went through a period of postpartum depression severe enough that her OB referred her to a psychiatrist, Dr. Farah Lindquist, whom she saw for 11 months. She took a low-dose shri for just over a year, attended therapy weekly, and by the fall of 2015 was, by every clinical measure, fully recovered. She never hid this from Derek. She told her sister. She told her mother. She mentioned it, in later years, to a grand total of maybe 4 other people, because it was a hard year, and she'd moved past it, and it had absolutely no bearing on the parent she'd been for the 10 years since. Derek remembered it too. He remembered it so well, in fact, that a decade later he would hand Dr. Lindquist's name to Grant Whitfield and ask him to subpoena her records. By 2020, Marsh Premier Developments was worth, by any honest accounting, somewhere north of $5 million. Derek had expanded from single-family spec homes into small multifamily developments across the greater Charlotte area, a 14-unit townhome project in Matthews, a mixed-use retail and residential building in Noda, a 32-unit complex outside Concord that alone was projected to net him $1.1 million on completion. He drove a Range Rover. He joined a country club in Ballantyne. He started taking site visits that ran later and later into the evening, then occasionally into the next morning, framed always as the unavoidable cost of building something real. Elena believed him. For a long time she believed him completely, because believing him was easier, and because she had 2 children, a mortgage on a $1.4 million home in the Ballantyne area, and a life that from the outside looked exactly like the life she'd been raised to want. There were moments, in hindsight, that should have told her more than they did at the time. In February 2024, Derek came home from what he said was a 2-day site visit to a prospective land parcel outside Salisbury, smelling faintly of a perfume Elena didn't recognize. And when she mentioned it, lightly, almost as a joke, he said the general contractor's wife had hugged him goodbye at a site dinner, and Elena, exhausted, midway through helping Mason with a school project, let it go. In June of that same year, at Derek's mother's 70th birthday party in Concord, his mother, Patricia Marsh, pulled Elena aside during the dessert course and said, not unkindly but not gently either, "You know Derek works so hard. I do hope you're making sure he feels appreciated at home." A comment that landed like a small blade, implying, without stating it, that whatever distance had crept into the marriage was a maintenance failure on Elena's end, rather than anything Derek himself might be doing. Elena smiled, said something non-committal, and drove home in silence while Derek talked on speakerphone with a subcontractor the entire way. By the fall of 2024, Derek was traveling for site visits, an average of 9 to 11 nights a month, according to the shared family calendar Elena kept. Nights that, once Discovery pulled his actual GPS-tagged expense reports and hotel folios the following year, would map with uncomfortable precision onto stays at the Kimpton Tryon Park Hotel, less than 14 minutes from their own front door. After what you're about to hear Derek Marsh did to Elena, I want a number from 1 to 10. How angry are you right now? Drop it below. Because this is only the beginning, and it gets a lot more satisfying from here. The first crack came in September of 2023, though Elena didn't recognize it as a crack at the time. Derek's assistant at Marsh Premier had changed twice in the previous 18 months. First, a woman named Kayla who left after 7 months with no real explanation. Then, in January 2023, a new hire, Bianca Cole, 29, an ambitious former commercial leasing agent Derek had poached from a competing firm with a salary bump to $92,000 a year, a number Elena only learned much later was nearly double what the position had ever paid before. Bianca was smart. She was good at her job. Within 8 months, she'd been promoted to Chief Operating Officer of Marsh Premier Developments, a title that, on paper, made sense, given how quickly the company was scaling. Elena met her exactly twice, once at the company's holiday party in December 2023, and once at a ribbon cutting for the Concord project in the spring of 2024. Both times, Bianca was polished, professional, warm in the specific practiced way of someone who is very good at making people feel comfortable. Elena liked her, in the shallow way you like someone you've met twice. What Elena didn't know, what she wouldn't discover until nearly a year later, was that by November 2023, Derek and Bianca had begun an affair that would run, by the time it was documented in full, for approximately 14 months. Hotel receipts later obtained during discovery would show 6 separate stays at the Kimpton Tryon Park Hotel in Uptown Charlotte between December 2023 and October 2024, each charged not to Derek's personal card, but to a Marsh Premier corporate account under the line item Client Entertainment. Text messages, later recovered through a forensic data request, would show a rhythm of communication that had nothing to do with business. Messages sent at 11:40 p.m., at 6:15 a.m., messages with names Derek and Elena's children didn't appear in, timestamps that lined up, with damning precision, against nights Derek had told Elena he was in Concord or Matthews handling permitting issues. One of those recovered messages, dated August 14, 2024, sent from Derek to Bianca at 10:52 p.m., while he'd told Elena he was at a zoning board meeting in Matthews that had, per public record, actually adjourned at 7:30 that evening, read simply, "Wish you were the one I came home to tonight." Another, from Bianca to Derek, sent the following morning, read, "Soon." Neither message referenced Golden Oak, Ridgeline, or any of the financial maneuvering that would later dominate the case, but both would be entered into evidence anyway, as part of the broader timeline Reyes was quietly assembling, proof, corroborating everything else, that the affair and the asset concealment were running on parallel tracks that had started at almost exactly the same time. Elena found out about the affair itself in a moment that had nothing to do with any of her later investigation. A small, almost accidental discovery in January 2025, 2 months before Derek filed. She was searching Derek's phone, which had been left charging on the kitchen counter, for a photo of Mason's school project she needed to print, and a text preview flashed across the locked screen from a contact saved simply as B. MPD, the kind of generic, business-sounding label that was clearly meant to blend into the dozens of other work contacts on his phone. The preview read, "Can't stop thinking about Friday." Elena stood in her kitchen at 7:40 in the morning, her son's backpack still on the counter beside her, and felt the floor of her life shift very slightly beneath her. In the particular way it does when you've suspected something for a long time and finally have a piece of it in front of you. She said nothing to Derek that morning. She said nothing to him for weeks. She told her sister, quietly, over the phone that same afternoon, and Marisol asked her the obvious question, "Are you going to confront him?" And Elena, surprising herself with her own answer, said, "Not yet. I want to know what else I don't know first." It was, in hindsight, the first small flicker of the strategist she would fully become 3 months later, standing in a garage with a printed email in her hand. But the affair, as devastating as it was, wasn't even the worst of it. The worst of it, the part that would matter far more in that courtroom in October, was the money. Starting in early 2024, financial records would later show, Derek began restructuring Marsh Premier Development's asset holdings in a way that had no legitimate business purpose, except to make the company, and Derek's personal wealth, look smaller than it was. In March 2024, he formed a new Delaware LLC called Golden Oak Holdings, into which he transferred the deed for the 32-unit Concord complex, a property independently appraised just 8 months earlier at $3.9 million, for a paper sale of $1.2 million to Golden Oak, an entity Derek owned entirely through a second shell, Ridgeline Capital Partners, registered in North Carolina under his cousin's name, Todd Marsh, who had no active role in the business whatsoever, and, when later deposed, would admit under oath that he'd signed some papers Derek asked me to sign, and had no idea what Ridgeline actually did. By the time Derek filed for divorce on March 3, 2025, filing first, notably, in what his attorney would later frame as decisive action and what Elena's team would later frame very differently, Marsh Premier Development's books showed a company valued at $1.8 million. The real number, once Elena's team finished tracing the transfers, the undervalued sales, and the retained equity hidden inside Golden Oak and Ridgeline, was closer to $6.4 million. Nearly $2.3 million of that had been moved, quietly and deliberately, in the 11 months before he filed. At his deposition on June 10, 2025, under oath, with a court reporter transcribing every word, Derek Marsh was asked directly by Danielle Reyes whether he had transferred any marital assets into entities not disclosed on his financial affidavit. He said no. He said it twice, in fact, with the specific calm of a man who has said something untrue often enough that it no longer registers to him as a lie. At that same deposition, when asked to characterize Elena's contributions to the marriage, he said, and this is verbatim, pulled directly from the transcript, "She stayed home. She did some design work here and there for pocket money. I built the business. I built everything we have." At that same June deposition, Reyes asked Derek a follow-up question that would matter more than it seemed to at the time: whether he had ever discussed Marsh Premier's finances, structure, or any pending property transfers with anyone outside the company's accounting staff. Derek said no. When Reyes asked specifically whether he had discussed the company's restructuring with Bianca Cole, he paused for just over 2 seconds. A pause the court reporter's transcript captured, but could not, of course, convey the weight of, before answering, "Bianca is our COO. Obviously we discuss company matters. That's her job." It was, on its face, an unremarkable answer. Reyes wrote a single word in the margin of her notes that afternoon. Later. And when his attorney later suggested, in a private mediation session in July, that Elena might struggle to secure primary custody given her documented mental health history, Derek said nothing to correct him. He let it stand. He let a decade-old, fully resolved postpartum episode become a weapon aimed at his own children's mother, because it was useful, and because he had convinced himself, somewhere along the way, that Elena simply didn't have it in her to fight back. That was his real mistake. Not the affair. Not even the money. It was underestimating her. Elena just crossed a line in her own mind that she can never walk back from. Have you ever had that moment yourself, where you stopped trying to be the bigger person and started planning instead? Tell me about it in the comments. I want to know what tipped you over. The moment it happened wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed door, no scene. It happened on a Tuesday evening in late April 2025, 6 weeks after Derek filed, while Elena was going through a banker's box of old tax documents in the garage, looking for a 2019 return her accountant needed for something unrelated to the divorce entirely. Tucked between 2 folders, she found a printed email. One Derek had evidently printed for his own records at some point, and forgotten in the box. Dated the previous November. Addressed to a man named Curtis Boone, a commercial real estate attorney Elena had never heard of. The subject line read, "Golden Oak, structure before filing." The body of the email, 4 short paragraphs, referenced getting ahead of E's side and cleaning up the Concord numbers before anything's on the table. Elena read it 3 times, standing in the garage, in the fading evening light, with a stack of unrelated tax forms still in her other hand. She didn't cry. She'd expected, if a moment like this ever came, that she would cry. Instead, she felt something settle in her chest, cold and very clear, like a decision that had already been made somewhere beneath her awareness and was only now surfacing into words. He has been planning this for a year, and he thinks I'll never know. For 11 weeks, since Derek had filed in March, Elena had operated from a place of quiet, exhausted grief, the sense that a marriage she'd given 14 years to had simply run its course, that Derek had grown into someone she no longer recognized, and that the kindest thing she could do for herself, and for Sophie and Mason, was to get through the process with as much dignity as possible, and rebuild on the other side. She had, in fact, told her sister as much just 2 weeks earlier. "I don't want to fight him. I just want it to be fair." Standing in that garage, holding a printed email that proved Derek had begun plotting to hide money from her a full year before he ever filed. Fair stopped being something she trusted him to arrive at on his own. It became something she understood, with sudden and total clarity, she would have to force into existence herself. She put the email in her purse. She didn't confront him that night. She didn't confront him at all, in fact. Not for the 11 months that followed. Instead, she drove to her sister Marisol's house the next morning, sat at her kitchen table, and said the sentence that would end up defining everything that came after. "I'm done being surprised by him. From now on, I want to know everything before he does. Elena is about to build something here, and I don't think Derek sees it coming. Do you see where this is going yet? Drop your prediction in the comments before I show you exactly how she pulled this off." What followed, over the next 11 months, was not a single dramatic gesture. It was a campaign. Patient, procedural, and almost entirely invisible to Derek, who remained, throughout, supremely confident that he held every advantage. The first thing Elena did, within days of finding that email, was hire an attorney of her own who specialized in high-asset divorce and business valuation disputes. Danielle Reyes, a partner at a boutique family law firm in South Charlotte with a reputation, among the small circle of people who track such things, for being extraordinarily thorough and extraordinarily quiet about it. Reyes didn't do theatrics. She did discovery requests, forensic subpoenas, and depositions that read, on paper, like routine procedure, and functioned, in practice, like a slow-closing vice. The second thing Elena did was harder, and it took longer. She needed someone who understood real estate finance well enough to trace exactly what Derek had done with Golden Oak and Ridgeline, someone who could look at a set of transfer documents and property tax records and translate them into a story a family court judge would understand. Reyes recommended a forensic accountant named Ruth Okafor, a CPA with 15 years of experience, specifically in marital asset tracing, who worked out of an office in Dilworth and had, by her own account, seen every version of this before. Ruth's process began with something deceptively simple: public record. North Carolina property deeds are a matter of public record, filed with the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds, and so is the formation paperwork for LLCs registered with the Secretary of State. Over the course of about 6 weeks in May and June 2025, Ruth pulled every deed transfer connected to Marsh Premier Developments, going back 3 years, cross-referenced them against county tax appraisal records, and built a timeline that showed, in black and white, the exact dates and dollar amounts of every sale Derek had executed between entities he effectively controlled. The Concord Complex transfer, $3.9 million in independent appraisal value, sold to Golden Oak Holdings for $1.2 million in March 2024, was the clearest example, but it wasn't the only one. A retail strip in Noda, appraised at $890,000 in 2023, had been transferred to Ridgeline Capital Partners in August 2024 for $310,000. A parcel of undeveloped land near Mint Hill, purchased by Marsh Premier in 2021 for $180,000, and now, per Mecklenburg County's own updated assessment, worth closer to $610,000 given nearby commercial development, had simply never appeared on Derek's financial affidavit at all, left off entirely, as though it had never existed. Ruth's methodology went further than the deed records alone. She cross-referenced Marsh Premier's commercial insurance policy, a $6.1 million umbrella policy the company carried on its property holdings, filed with its carrier, Meridian Assurance Group, in January 2025, against the $1.8 million figure Derek had sworn to on his financial affidavit 2 months later, a discrepancy of nearly $4.3 million that Ruth flagged in bold in her working notes, with a single line, "You cannot insure a company for $6 million and swear it's worth $2 million. She pulled Marsh Premier's commercial loan applications from 2 regional lenders, First Piedmont Bank and Carolina Trust, both of which listed the company's total asset base at figures well north of $5 million, as recently as January 2025. Documents Derek had signed personally, under penalty of loan fraud, to secure financing for the remaining Concord phase, and which directly contradicted the $1.8 million figure he would later swear to under oath in his divorce filing, barely 6 weeks after signing them. Ruth also traced a pattern of unusual cash movement through a personal account Derek held at a credit union in Huntersville, one Elena hadn't known existed until Reyes subpoenaed his full banking history. 7 transfers between January and September 2024, totaling $187,000, moved out of that account and into an account held solely in Bianca Cole's name at a different bank entirely. Each transfer logged under a memo line reading simply "consulting fee," payments Bianca had no consulting contract, invoice, or 1099 tax form to substantiate, and which Ruth's report characterized, carefully, as difficult to reconcile with any legitimate business purpose given the absence of corresponding services rendered. Ruth Okafor's formal report, delivered to Reyes in early August, ran to 41 pages and concluded, in language careful enough to survive cross-examination, that Marsh Premier Development's true fair market value, including retained equity inside its shell subsidiaries, was approximately $6.4 million, nearly 3.5 times the $1.8 million figure Derek had sworn to under oath. Reyes and Ruth met with Elena every 3 to 4 weeks throughout that summer, always at Reyes's office, always in the late afternoon after Elena had picked the kids up from camp and dropped them with her mother for a few hours. At one of those meetings, in early July, Reyes laid out a whiteboard timeline spanning the full 18 months, every property transfer, every credit union withdrawal, every hotel stay, every deposition date still to come, and said to Elena, plainly, "This is going to take discipline. The temptation is going to be to use pieces of this the moment you find them. We can't. Everything lands at once, or it doesn't land at all." Elena, who by that point had not raised her voice at Derek in over 4 months despite sitting across from him at 2 separate mediation sessions, said only, "I've been patient for 14 years. I can manage a few more months." The mediation sessions themselves, in May and July, became, in retrospect, part of the plan's architecture rather than a separate track from it. In the May session, held in a conference room at a neutral mediation firm in South End, Whitfield opened by proposing a settlement offer that would have given Elena $890,000 total, roughly 14% of the true marital estate, along with joint custody weighted toward Derek's schedule, given his greater stability. Elena, coached carefully by Reyes beforehand, declined without visible emotion, said only that she'd need more time to consider her position, and left the building without a single word of protest, a silence Derek would later describe to a friend as her finally accepting reality. In the July session, Whitfield raised the offer slightly, to $1.1 million, and introduced, for the first time, the suggestion that Elena's documented mental health history made her an unreliable custodial parent, the moment Derek let the postpartum comment stand unchallenged. Elena sat through it, said even less than she had in May, and drove straight from that meeting to Ruth Okafor's office to review the completed insurance discrepancy findings. By September, the case file Reyes had assembled ran to over 600 pages, Ruth's 41-page valuation report, the insurance policy and loan applications, 7 months of subpoenaed bank records from 3 separate institutions, Grace Liu's deposition transcript, the private investigator's parking garage surveillance logs, hotel folios from the Kimpton Tryon Park, and, at the center of it, in a sealed evidence folder Reyes kept in a locked drawer separate from everything else, a single photographed letter that none of Derek's team knew existed at all. But a forensic accounting report, however airtight, tells a judge what happened with the money. It doesn't tell them why, and Reyes knew, from long experience, that judges respond differently to a paper trail of numbers than they do to a paper trail of intent. Numbers can be explained away as aggressive tax strategy, poor bookkeeping, an attorney's overcautious advice. Intent is much harder to spin. That was where the letter came in. Elena had known, since roughly the summer of 2024, that something was happening between Derek and Bianca Cole, not with proof, not yet, but with the particular exhausting certainty that comes from living inside a marriage long enough to read every small absence correctly. She hadn't acted on that suspicion before finding the email in the garage, in part because she genuinely wasn't sure it mattered legally, and in part because, if she were honest, some part of her hadn't wanted to know for certain. Once she decided to fight, though, the affair stopped being a private wound and became, strategically, a second front. Reyes explained to her, in their very first meeting, that under North Carolina law, marital misconduct alone rarely swings equitable distribution. The state is an equitable distribution jurisdiction, not a fault-based one, and judges are generally reluctant to punish infidelity directly in a financial award. But intent mattered enormously when it came to fraudulent conveyance, the legal term for exactly what Derek had done with Golden Oak and Ridgeline. Because North Carolina courts can, and do, claw back and reallocate assets that were deliberately hidden or transferred to defeat a spouse's rightful claim. And if the affair could be shown to be directly, provably connected to the asset concealment, if Elena could prove Derek hadn't just cheated, but had cheated and conspired with the person he was cheating with to hide marital property before she found out, that wasn't just embarrassing anymore. That was the kind of thing that turns a routine equitable distribution hearing into something closer to a fraud case. Elena didn't have direct evidence of that connection yet. What she had was patience, and a working theory about where such evidence might exist. She spent several evenings that summer doing something Reyes had specifically not asked her to do, but hadn't asked her not to either. Quietly reconstructing, in a notebook she kept in her nightstand, every fragment she could remember of the last 18 months that hadn't made sense at the time. The unexplained overnight in Salisbury. The perfume. Derek's mother's comment at the birthday party. A weekend in August 2024, when Derek had come home unusually generous, unusually attentive, taking the kids to the trampoline park without being asked, a mood Elena now understood, with the benefit of hindsight, as almost certainly guilt rather than affection. She wasn't building a legal case in that notebook. Reyes had the legal case well in hand. She was building something for herself, a private ledger of the version of events she'd actually lived through, so that later, when Derek's attorneys inevitably tried to rewrite the marriage into something smaller and more forgivable than it had been, she would have her own clear, unedited record to hold against theirs. It was slow, unglamorous work, done mostly at night after the kids were asleep, and it required a specific kind of discipline that had nothing to do with courtrooms at all. The discipline of sitting with her own anger long enough to use it, rather than letting it use her. There were nights that summer she cried over that notebook. There were nights she nearly called Derek just to ask him, plainly, why. Not for any strategic reason, just because some small, tired part of her still wanted to understand. She never made that call. Reyes had been clear about that too. Every conversation with Derek, from this point forward, was potential testimony. Elena kept her calls to him short, factual, and entirely about the children, and saved everything else for the notebook, and for Danielle Reyes's office, where it would eventually matter. She remembered something small, the kind of detail that means nothing at the time and everything in retrospect. In late 2023, not long after Bianca's promotion, Derek had mentioned, almost in passing, over dinner, that he'd rented a second safety deposit box at First Trust Bank downtown for company documents, deeds, stuff Ridgeline needs kept separate. Elena, at the time, had no reason to think twice about it. But the box 4417, at the First Trust branch on South Tryon Street, had been opened under both their names. A fact Elena discovered only because she was, technically, still a co-signer on the family's original joint accounts at that same bank, and a teller, processing an unrelated request in June 2025, mentioned it to her by accident. "Oh, and did you want to also access box 4417 while you're here? It's still listed under both names." As though she'd known about it all along. What she found inside, on a Thursday afternoon in late June 2025, sitting alone in a small viewing room at the bank with a box she hadn't known existed 40 minutes earlier, was a stack of documents relating to Ridgeline Capital Partners, and, folded inside a plain white envelope near the bottom, a single handwritten letter, 4 pages, dated February 3, 2024, on Marsh Premier Development's letterhead, addressed to Bianca. The letter was not subtle. Derek had written it, evidently, in a moment of what he must have believed was total privacy, perhaps intending to give it to Bianca directly, perhaps never intending to send it at all, a kind of confession scribbled out to organize his own thinking. In it, he described the affair in explicit terms. He described his marriage to Elena as something he'd outgrown. And, in the third page, in language that would later be read aloud, slowly, in a courtroom, he wrote, "I've already started moving the Concord numbers into Golden Oak. By the time E's lawyers figure out what Marsh Premier is actually worth, it'll be too late to touch it. I want to be free of this before she even knows to look." Elena read it standing in that small viewing room, and for the second time in this story, she did not cry. She photographed every page with her phone, replaced the letter exactly as she'd found it, and drove straight to Danielle Reyes's office. Reyes read it twice, set it down on her desk, and said, "This changes everything, but we don't use it yet." That was the part of the plan that took the most discipline, more in some ways than finding the letter at all. Reyes explained that if they confronted Derek with the letter immediately, or entered it into evidence too early, his legal team would have months to build a counter-narrative, to argue it was taken out of context, to argue Elena had somehow obtained it improperly, to prepare Bianca for a deposition where she'd have time to get her story straight. Instead, Reyes's strategy was to let Derek and Whitfield keep building the case they thought they were winning. Let them keep leaning on the postpartum depression history. Let them keep insisting Elena had contributed minimally. Let them walk fully and confidently into the final hearing believing they held every card. And only then, in rebuttal, once Whitfield had put his own credibility on the line, with a narrative the letter would directly demolish, produce it. Over the following months, Reyes quietly built the rest of the case around that eventual reveal. She subpoenaed hotel records from the Kimpton Tryon Park, which corroborated the letter's timeline exactly. She identified, through Marsh Premier's own payroll records obtained via discovery, a bookkeeper named Grace Liu, who had worked for the company since 2019 and who, when formally deposed in August, testified, carefully, professionally, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to perjure herself, that she had been instructed by Derek personally, sometime around March of last year, to reclassify certain property transfers on the company's internal books, in a way that didn't match the actual sale documentation, and that when she raised concerns, Derek told her it was just for tax purposes, and to let it go. Reyes had Ruth Okafor formally certify her 41-page forensic report as an expert exhibit. She had a licensed private investigator, hired discreetly in September, confirm through public parking garage records that Derek's Range Rover had been present at the Kimpton Tryon Park garage on 4 of the 6 dates the hotel receipts indicated. And she prepared Bianca Cole's subpoena carefully, not framing it, on paper, as a witness to the affair at all, but as a corporate officer with direct knowledge of Marsh Premier Development's 2024 asset restructuring, a framing technically true and legally unassailable, which meant Bianca would have no advance warning of exactly what she was about to be asked, or why. The private investigator Reyes hired, a former Charlotte Mecklenburg police detective named Walter Prentice, who now ran a small licensing and surveillance practice out of an office near the airport, worked strictly within the bounds of what North Carolina law permitted: public parking garage entry logs, publicly accessible business records, and observation from public property, nothing that would open the evidence itself to a suppression challenge later. Prentice's final report, delivered in late September, was 4 pages long and almost clinically dry, listing dates, times, and license plate confirmations with no editorializing at all, which was precisely what made it so effective on the stand. It wasn't an accusation, it was simply a record, one more piece of a mosaic that, item by item, none of them dramatic on their own, added up to something no one in that courtroom would be able to explain away. Through all of this, for 11 months, Elena said almost nothing to Derek, beyond what was strictly required in shared custody logistics. She showed up to mediation sessions calm and, by Derek's own later admission to a friend, weirdly quiet, like she'd already given up. She let him believe that. She let Whitfield believe it too. Every time Whitfield built one more brick into his narrative of the tired, unambitious, mentally fragile ex-wife, Elena sat across from him and thought, privately, of a folded letter sitting in a locked drawer in Danielle Reyes's office, waiting. By the time the final equitable distribution hearing was scheduled for October, Elena Marsh had spent nearly a year building a case, so thorough that the only real question left was timing. When, exactly, to open the folder? The answer turned out to be exactly 9 minutes after Grant Whitfield told a family court judge, with complete confidence, that Elena Marsh had contributed nothing of substance to 14 years of marriage. The morning of the hearing, Derek arrived at the courthouse 20 minutes early, in the charcoal suit, with Whitfield already reviewing notes beside him. He looked, by every account of people who saw him in the hallway, entirely at ease, the look of a man who has already won the argument in his own head and is simply waiting for the formality of everyone else catching up. Whitfield's opening strategy was exactly what Reyes had anticipated, almost line for line. He walked the court through Derek's financial affidavit, the $1.8 million valuation of Marsh Premier Developments, and argued that given this modest figure, and given Elena's limited income from her design consulting, a straightforward 50-50 split of liquid assets, with Derek retaining full ownership of the business, was the only equitable outcome. He spent nearly 20 minutes characterizing Marsh Premier as a company still finding its footing, describing the Concord and Noda properties as underperforming assets that required significant reinvestment, language crafted, transparently, to make Derek's undervaluation sound like prudent business caution rather than what it actually was. He then pivoted, as expected, to custody, referencing Elena's documented history of postpartum depression in 2015, and suggesting, without ever quite saying it outright, that primary custody should default to Derek given the stability of his current household and business success, a phrase he repeated twice more before sitting down, as though repetition alone might make it truer. He even, at one point, played a short audio clip, a voicemail Elena had left Derek in March, tired and frustrated after a long day, her voice cracking slightly as she said she couldn't do this anymore. A clip Whitfield presented, stripped of all context, as evidence of instability. Judge Castellano listened to it with an expression that gave nothing away. Then Whitfield sat down, and Judge Castellano turned to Reyes and asked whether the petitioner had anything further. Danielle Reyes stood. "Yes, Your Honor. Quite a bit, actually." She began with Ruth Okafor's forensic report, walking the court methodically through the Concord transfer, the Noda strip, the Mint Hill land that had simply vanished from Derek's affidavit entirely. She entered the Register of Deeds filings into evidence, side by side with the independent appraisals, letting the numbers speak for themselves. $3.9 million, sold for $1.2 million. $890,000, sold for $310,000. Whitfield objected twice. Both times, Judge Castellano overruled him, noting the documents were matters of public record and directly relevant to the accuracy of the respondent's sworn financial affidavit. Then Reyes called Grace Liu to the stand. Grace, visibly nervous but steady, testified about the instruction to reclassify the property transfers, about being told to let it go when she raised concerns. She described, in careful detail, the specific afternoon in March 2024 when Derek had called her into his office, closed the door, and told her that the Concord transfer to Golden Oak needed to be booked at $1.2 million for now, with the difference held in a separate internal ledger for accounting cleanup later. a ledger Grace herself had maintained on a password-protected spreadsheet that Ruth Okafor's team had recovered, in full, from a company server during discovery, and which matched the true $3.9 million appraisal almost to the dollar. Whitfield's cross-examination tried to characterize her as a disgruntled former employee. Grace had, in fact, resigned from Marsh Premier in September, unable to stomach what she'd been asked to help conceal. But the timeline of her employment records and the payroll documentation Reyes had already entered made that framing difficult to sustain, and Grace's own quiet, unpolished answer to Whitfield's insinuation, "I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I didn't want my name on those numbers," did more damage to Derek's case than anything Reyes herself said all morning. Then came Bianca Cole. She was called, per her subpoena, as a corporate officer of Marsh Premier Developments, with knowledge of the 2024 restructuring. Whitfield, still confident, raised no objection, apparently assuming this would be a dry, technical exchange about corporate paperwork. Reyes asked her a series of careful, procedural questions about Golden Oak Holdings and Ridgeline Capital Partners, when she'd first learned of their formation, what her role had been in the transfers, whether she'd had any conversations with Derek about the timing of those transfers relative to the divorce filing. Bianca answered the first several questions, cautiously but honestly. She had, after all, been formally advised by her own attorney, prior to the hearing, that lying under oath carried consequences far more severe than an uncomfortable afternoon. Yes, she was aware of Golden Oak's formation. Yes, Derek had discussed the timing with her directly. Yes, he had told her, more than once, that he wanted the numbers cleaned up before Elena's side could see them. Reyes pressed further, still methodical, still giving no indication of where the questioning was headed. "Miss Cole, are you aware of 7 wire transfers totaling $187,000 made from an account held by Mr. Marsh at a Huntersville credit union into an account held in your name between January and September of last year?" Bianca's composure, steady until that point, faltered slightly. Yes. Can you explain the business purpose of those transfers?" A pause. Whitfield, sensing danger for the first time, half rose as if to object, though on what grounds wasn't clear even to him. "There wasn't really it wasn't tied to a specific project," Bianca said finally. "Derek said it was compensation for additional responsibilities." "Did you invoice Marsh Premier Developments for those funds? Did you report them as income?" "No," Bianca said quietly. "Not yet. I was going to." Reyes let the silence sit for a moment, before moving on, deliberately not pushing further. She didn't need to. The number was in the record now, unexplained, alongside everything else. Reyes asked one more question. "Ms. Cole, are you familiar with a letter, dated February 3, 2024, written by Mr. Marsh, addressed to you?" Bianca went very still. Yes. "Do you recall its contents?" "Generally, yes." Reyes turned to the judge. "Your Honor, at this time, the petitioner would like to formally enter Exhibit 14 into the record." This was the moment. This was the exact moment, 9 minutes after Whitfield had told the court Elena contributed nothing of substance, that the folder Elena's thumb had been resting on all morning finally opened. Judge Castellano read the letter in silence, all 4 pages, while the courtroom waited. When she reached the 3rd page, "I've already started moving the Concord numbers into Golden Oak. I want to be free of this before she even knows to look." Her expression, for the first time all morning, changed. Not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes, the look of a judge who has read thousands of financial affidavits and has just confirmed, in a defendant's own handwriting, exactly what she suspected the moment Ruth Okafor's numbers hit the record. She set the letter down and looked, directly, at Derek Marsh. Whitfield stood immediately, objecting to authenticity, arguing the letter had been improperly obtained from a jointly held safety deposit box. Reyes was ready for this too. She pointed out, calmly, that Elena Marsh was a legal cosigner on Box 4417 at First Trust Bank, with full documented access rights, and that nothing about her retrieval of a document from a box she was legally entitled to open constituted improper acquisition of evidence. Judge Castellano overruled the objection, noting for the record that the letter's authorship had already been effectively confirmed by the witness on the stand. Derek's face, by every account of the people sitting in that gallery, went through several distinct stages in the span of about 90 seconds. First confusion, then a flash of genuine panic, then something that settled, finally, into a kind of hollow stillness. The look of a man doing rapid math on exactly how much of his carefully constructed narrative had just collapsed, and realizing the answer was all of it. Now that you've seen how far this went, was Elena justified in how she handled this? Did she go too far, or honestly not far enough? I want your verdict in the comments. Be honest. Judge Castellano did not rule that day. She took the matter under advisement for 11 days, ordering, in the meantime, a full forensic audit of Marsh Premier Development's books to be conducted by an independent court-appointed accountant, cross-referencing everything Ruth Okafor had already found. When the ruling came down on October 21st, it was not gentle. Judge Castellano found, in a 14-page written opinion, that Derek Marsh had knowingly and deliberately engaged in fraudulent conveyance of marital assets with the specific intent to defeat his spouse's equitable claim, citing the February 2024 letter as direct, unambiguous evidence of that intent. Evidence, she noted pointedly, of a kind rarely available to a court in cases of this nature, and all the more damning for its clarity. She ordered the true valuation of Marsh Premier Developments, $6.4 million, restored to the marital estate for purposes of distribution, and, citing the deliberate concealment as an aggravating factor, North Carolina law explicitly permits courts to weigh in dividing marital property, awarded Elena 65% of the total marital estate, rather than the standard even split. A final award, including the family home, retirement accounts, and a structured settlement against Marsh Premier Development's assets of just over $4.1 million. She awarded Elena primary physical custody of Sophie and Mason, finding no credible evidence that Elena's fully resolved 2015 postpartum treatment bore any relevance whatsoever to her fitness as a parent, and noted, in a line that would later be quoted in a Charlotte Business Journal piece about the case, that she found it troubling that respondents' counsel would attempt to weaponize a decade-old, successfully treated medical episode while simultaneously concealing over $2 million in marital assets from the very same court. She also referred the matter of Derek's sworn financial affidavit, the one in which he'd stated, under oath, that Marsh Premier Developments was worth $1.8 million, to the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office for review of potential perjury charges, and separately referred the Golden Oak and Ridgeline transaction records to the North Carolina Department of Revenue, given clear indications the transfers may also have been structured to understate the company's tax liability. Judge Castellano's written opinion also addressed, directly, the voicemail Whitfield had played during his opening. The clip of Elena, exhausted, saying she couldn't do this anymore. She noted, dryly, that having reviewed the full context surrounding that voicemail, including the date it was left, which fell 3 days after Derek had returned from an unexplained overnight stay he'd told Elena was a site visit to Salisbury, she found the recording considerably less probative of instability than counsel suggested, and considerably more probative of a spouse under legitimate strain from circumstances the respondent himself was actively concealing from her at the time. It was, by the standards of a written judicial opinion, close to a rebuke. None of it required violence. None of it required a raised voice, a public scene, a single moment where Elena said something she'd regret. It required 11 months of patience, one forensic accountant, one careful attorney, one nervous bookkeeper willing to tell the truth, and a single sheet of paper Derek Marsh had written himself, in his own hand, believing no one would ever read it but the woman he was writing it to. By the time bailiffs escorted the parties out of courtroom 4C that afternoon, word of the ruling had already reached the small, tightly networked world of Charlotte's commercial real estate community. Two of Marsh Premier Development's active project partners quietly paused pending deals within the week, citing the need to review financial disclosures. A regional bank that held a $2.6 million construction loan on the Concord project's remaining phase requested an emergency review of Marsh Premier's books. The North Carolina Real Estate Commission opened a preliminary inquiry into whether Derek's broker's license required review, given the DOR referral. Phil Aldrich, the same business partner who'd once toasted Derek as the guy who built all this from nothing, quietly ended a 3-year-old informal partnership on 2 upcoming Matthews developments within a month of the ruling becoming public record, citing, in a brief phone call to Derek, that a mutual acquaintance later described secondhand, a need to protect his own reputation with his lenders. None of this destroyed him outright. He kept the company, kept his license, kept, eventually, most of what remained after the settlement. But the version of Derek Marsh who walked into that courthouse that morning, certain of his own advantage, did not walk back out. In the parking garage afterward, Bianca Cole did not wait for him. She had already resigned from Marsh Premier Developments by email that same afternoon. 2 lines, no explanation offered or needed. She would later reach a separate settlement with the North Carolina Department of Revenue over the undeclared $187,000, paying back taxes, penalties, and interest, totaling just under $61,000, and would leave Charlotte entirely by the following spring, taking a position with a commercial brokerage in Richmond, Virginia, where, as far as anyone in her old circle could tell, she never spoke about Marsh Premier Developments again. Grant Whitfield's firm quietly declined to represent Derek in any further proceedings related to the DOR and district attorney referrals, citing, in a brief and carefully worded letter, a shift in the scope of representation. Derek retained new counsel for the resulting tax and perjury inquiries, at considerable additional expense, and though the district attorney's office ultimately declined, in early 2026, to pursue formal perjury charges, citing the practical difficulty of proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt in a civil-adjacent financial matter, even one this well-documented, the North Carolina Department of Revenue did assess Marsh Premier Developments just over $340,000 in back taxes and penalties tied to the undervalued property transfers. A bill Derek paid in full, rather than contest further, in a system that had already, once, taken his own handwriting and turned it against him. 6 months later, Elena Voss, she'd gone back to using her maiden name within weeks of the ruling, a small, deliberate reclamation, opened a design studio of her own on East Boulevard, funded in part by her settlement, Voss Interior Studio, 3 employees, a growing client list, built almost entirely on referrals from women in Charlotte who'd heard some version of her story secondhand and wanted specifically to work with her. Sophie and Mason split time between 2 households, but the bulk of their week, soccer practice, homework, the ordinary architecture of a normal childhood, happened in the home Elena had kept, the one with the kitchen where she'd once sat across from her sister and said she was done being surprised. She didn't gloat. People who met her for the first time, hearing the broad outline of the story secondhand, sometimes expected someone harder, sharper, someone visibly triumphant. Instead, they found a woman who talked about the whole thing, when she talked about it at all, with something closer to quiet exhaustion than victory, the tone of someone describing a long, difficult project she was relieved, finally, to have finished. Danielle Reyes still keeps a redacted, anonymized version of the case timeline pinned to a corkboard in her office, not to display it, but because, as she told a junior associate once, it's the cleanest example I have of what patience actually looks like when it's done right. Ruth Okafor, for her part, cited the Marsh case, again anonymized, in professional continuing education settings only, as a model example of how public record alone, patiently assembled, can dismantle evaluation built on nothing but confidence and other people's assumption that no one would ever bother to check. Asked once, by her sister, whether it had been worth it. The 11 months of silence, the discipline of saying nothing, the strange, cold patience of sitting across a mediation table from a man she knew was lying and letting him keep lying, because the lie was useful. Elena thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I didn't do it to hurt him," she said finally. "I did it because I was tired of being the only one in the marriage who had to tell the truth. I just made sure that, for once, the truth got to speak for itself, in a room where it actually mattered." Sophie, now 12, has started asking more direct questions about the divorce as she's gotten older. Not about the money or the letter, which Elena has never discussed with either child in any detail, but simpler questions, the kind children ask when they're trying to understand what happened to the shape of their family. Elena's answer has stayed consistent each time, that sometimes people stop being honest with each other, and that when that happens, the most important thing is figuring out how to still be honest with yourself. Mason, 9, mostly just wanted to know if they'd get to keep the house, and when Elena told him yes, he asked if his room could finally be painted the dark green he'd wanted for 2 years, and Derek had always vetoed as too moody for resale value. It's green now. Voss Interior Studio closed out its first full year with 11 active clients and a small feature in a regional design publication that Elena, notably, did not pursue or pitch. A former client had simply mentioned her, unprompted, to an editor. She hired her second employee, a recent NC State graduate named Priya Chandrasekaran, in the spring, and the two of them now split their days between client consultations and the quieter, more satisfying work of drafting floor plans in a small studio space that, unlike everything else in the last 14 years of Elena's life, has her name on the lease and nobody else's. She still keeps a copy of the letter, not the original, which remains sealed in the court record, but a photograph of it, the same one she took standing alone in a bank viewing room on a Thursday afternoon in June. She's never looked at it since the hearing. She doesn't need to. She knows exactly what it says. If you've ever had to fight quietly for something someone tried to take from you, if you've ever had to build your own case, in your own time, while everyone around you assumed you'd already lost, tell me about it in the comments below. I want to hear how you got even. And if this one hit for you, you know what to do. Subscribe to the Revenge Vault, because there's always another letter, another folder, another quiet person nobody saw coming, sitting somewhere right now, patiently building the case nobody else believes she's capable of building. We'll open the next one soon.